So the third experiment was conducted again in the early 1990s by the Institute of Heart and Math, a pioneering research organization based in Northern California that are exploring the human heart is much more than simply as a pump that moves blood through our bodies. And although our hearts do precisely that, it may be the least of what our hearts do. They're discovering that our hearts are the strongest magnetic field in our bodies, and the electromagnetic field that is produced by our hearts has an effect that extends well beyond our bodies. The HeartMath Institute had earlier discovered that around every human heart there is a field of energy shaped like a tube. It's called a tube torus, and extends between 5 and 8 feet beyond the human heart. And the question is, in this already acknowledged field, could there be another form of energy that is being carried by this field beyond our bodies? So they designed an experiment to test precisely this theory. This is no surprise. They took some human DNA and they isolated the DNA and asked individuals that were trained to feel what are called coherent human emotions, very clear emotions of love, appreciation, compassion, or anger, rage, and hate, to have those feelings on demand. And as the people who were trained to have the feelings did so, they measured the way the DNA responded. And what they found was this. They found that in the presence of appreciation, love, compassion, forgiveness, the DNA became tremendously relaxed. And what we know from other experiments is that this relaxed state of DNA actually enhances our immune response. When you ask people what it is about the feelings of love and compassion that give us our high immune response, this may begin to tell us why, because the DNA is relaxed and actually allows certain portions of those little switches, if you want to think of them that way, to be enabled or turned on. And just the opposite is true as well. In the presence of anger, rage, hate, and jealousy, DNA was tightened like a little knot, and it actually shut down in some instances. Those little switches depleted the immune response. Intuitively, we know this. We know that when people live in a state of jealousy or anger or rage, that it depresses those portions of our bodies, and just the opposite, love, compassion, understanding, forgiveness, that those kinds of things are enhanced. And now, perhaps for the first time, these experiments are beginning to help us to understand why. It's the effect of human emotion on what is called the conformation or the shape of the DNA in our bodies. And what these experiments showed, and what the lab results, the lab notes in the published papers actually described, was that very specific kinds of human emotion have the power to change the shape of the DNA in our bodies. And this is an amazing thing to say, because what it says is that on demand, when we choose to elicit very specific kinds of feelings and emotions inside of our bodies, we actually have the power to change the way the DNA functions in our bodies. This is the beginning of an internal technology, perhaps a very ancient technology that was described in languages of our past that we're only beginning to understand. Well, each of these three experiments was interesting unto itself. In some instances, the researchers were not aware of the experiments that the other laboratories were doing. And these experiments are only representative. Other experiments have been conducted along the same lines, giving the same kinds of results. When you put them all together, however, rather than being interesting, isolated experiments, they begin to tell a story. And the story looks something like this. The first experiment, Vladimir Poponin's experiment, said that the DNA in our bodies has a direct effect on our world, on the physical stuff our world is made of on the energetic level. The last experiment shows that human emotion has the ability to change the DNA that's having an effect on the world around us. And the middle experiment, the one that was conducted by the United States Army, shows that whether we're in the same building or 400 miles apart, the effect is the same. We're not bound by space and time. And as a matter of fact, the results of the experiments are saying precisely this, that you and I have a power within our bodies that is not bound by the laws of physics the way we understand them today. That something within us linked directly to the emotion of our bodies, thoughts, feelings, our prayers, our beliefs, transcends the limits of time and space the way we begin to understand them today. Ancient traditions describe this in the language of their time. Not only do they say that we are connected to the world around us, just the way Western science is now discovering, they invite us one step further, and they say, here's how you apply it in your life. They left us very, very clear instructions saying this is the way you use this power, this inner technology within you to bring about change in your world, to bring about healing in your body, to bring about peace in your families and in your communities, and collectively, as many people come together, these principles work as peace between nations as well. And I'll share with you some of the studies that were done that describe precisely how this begins to work. One of the questions that I'm often asked with regard to this material is if these relationships exist, if they truly exist, why don't we know about them today? Why doesn't Western science understand these principles? Why are we just now discovering them? Well, the answer to that question begins in our understanding that the way we view our world today, our knowledge, is part of a lineage of wisdom that links us with our past. And we know that that link, the link that ties us with those who have come before us, has been broken at least 2 times in recorded history. Twice in recorded history, something happened, an event occurred, and we lost information. And in some instances, it's information pertaining precisely to what we're doing right now. The first one of those breaks was with the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria in the 4th century. While we don't know precisely what was in that library, what we do know is that Roman historians had cataloged volumes and volumes of information. Scrolls is the way that material was written at that time. The Roman historian Callimachos, for example, cataloged over 536,000 scrolls in the Great Library of Alexandria before it was burned, and many of them were very ancient in that time, in the 4th century. And we know that the scrolls contain some of the most ancient documents of the Hebraic, ancient Hebrew traditions, of the Egyptian astronomical traditions and medical traditions, much of the wisdom that had been passed down from thousands of years earlier, describing our relationship to our world, to one another, and perhaps to something even greater. When that library burned, we know we lost tremendous amounts of information then. And the second time was with the edits of the Western biblical texts, the biblical traditions in the 4th century as well, in the year 325 AD. It was during this time in the early Christian traditions when the Emperor Constantine pulled together a council. And at that time there was no biblical text, nice, neat, compiled text the way we see it today. It was a loose assemblage. Many of the texts were redundant. Some of them were poorly written. And very few people were able to access this material. And Constantine, in an effort to make it more accessible to a broad general audience, pulled together a council within the church and said, "Council, make me some recommendations. What should we leave in? What should we take out? How should we arrange this material?" And the result of that was what we call today our Western biblical text, biblical tradition. We know that at least 20 books were completely removed, and another 20 to 25 were tremendously edited, and the remaining texts were condensed and rearranged into what we see today as our biblical text. So as good as our Bible is today, the best biblical scholars will openly and freely admit that it is incomplete. And we know this because we're finding these documents in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. This is why they were so controversial. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time, we were able to see many of these books in their original form. Some of them hadn't been seen for 1,700 years. And interestingly, many of the books that were edited or taken out completely are precisely the documents that describe our relationship to the universe and the creation around us through the power of human emotion. So now that science is beginning to tell us in its language, ancient spiritual traditions have shown us in their way, and in our own texts and documents, we're seeing references to precisely how these principles work. The question is, how do we apply them in our lives? How do we go about making use of this relationship between thoughts, feelings, and emotions inside of our bodies and what's happening in the world around us? Well, perhaps the best place to begin is by defining what a thought and a feeling and emotion really are. I've had this conversation with my mom many, many times. And Mom always says to me, she goes, "I always thought feelings and emotions were the same thing." And while they're closely related, there is a difference. So if we think of a chart, if you look at the ancient charts of the energy centers in our bodies, the chakra centers, if you will, what we see is the lower three energy centers of our bodies, they are closely associated with what we call the power of human emotion. And the ancients said we're capable of only two primary emotions. They said we're capable of the emotion of love, and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. Whether we think of that as fear or hate. And when you get really deep into the traditions, what we find is they're actually both polarities of the same force. So in those lower centers, the power of emotion, we have two primary experiences, love and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. This is a power, it's a force that drives us forward in life, and it tears down the walls, knocks down the barriers that stand between us and the things that we hold dear in our lives. Emotion, however, is scattered. It has to be focused. You can think of it as a power. If you know people live strictly in their emotions, you know that sometimes their lives can be a little chaotic. Well, the emotions need to be focused, and this is where the power of thought or logic come in, and it's associated with the upper energy centers of the body. Thought is what gives focus or direction to the emotions. In other words, we have a thought about something. We have a thought about a cloudy day outside. And that thought, into that thought, we fuel the power of the emotion, either our love of that rainy day or our fear of what that rainy day may bring to us. And by doing so, when we marry the power of emotion with the direction of the thought, by virtue of that, we create a feeling. So feeling, by definition, is the union of emotion and the thought. And the one energy center, interestingly enough, that is not accounted for in all the other systems, that remains unused in these ancient systems, is the heart center, and this is the one that is dedicated to the power of feeling. We feel in our hearts. So the feeling that we have in our hearts is the language that speaks to the field that Western science is now beginning to understand through their experiments. It's the power of human feeling that is the language that opens the door to the possibilities of what we create in our world.